When we read or hear about the Spanish presence in California and in the whole Southwest for that matter, the main focus tends to be on the missions, which were a very important religious and cultural institution. But at the time that the missions were being established, the other arm of that Spanish presence was the Presidios. The Presidios, which were the military presence on the frontier of the Spanish Empire. Today, I'm talking with someone who is a real expert on Presidios and a real expert on the Spanish history of California. His name is Michael Hardwick, and he just wrote a book called Spanish Arms and Armaments of the Presidios in California. Michael graduated with a degree in anthropology from the University of California in Santa Barbara and worked on archaeology at the Presidio of Santa Barbara, which eventually became the state historic park of El Presidio. He worked also at La Purísima as a ranger, and he established the archive there. And for many years, he helped interpret and preserve La Purísima mission. On top of it, he's a veteran of the U.S. Navy, and so he has a very firsthand knowledge of military munitions and armaments and strategy. And so I think he's an excellent person to talk to about this. As a final note, and an interesting note, he founded a reenactment group, a very unique one, which is called Los Soldados del Real Presidio de Santa Barbara, which was a reenactment group dedicated to reenacting Spanish military costumes and armaments, etc., in California. It started back in 1990. So Mike's going to talk about writing this book, the discoveries he made along the way, and he's going to introduce us to a lot of little-known facts about California's early military history. I think you're really going to like it. Just one note, if you're listening to this and not watching it, Mike refers to images from a presentation he made. So if you want to see the images, you should make sure and check it out on YouTube. Of course, he describes what's going on in those images. So if you're just following this on purely audio format, that's fine. But if you want to see the pictures, I would go and watch it on YouTube and purchase the book because all of the pictures are also in his book. So for more information about that, listen. And I've included all the information about how to get the book and how to contact and know more about Mike in the notes to this episode. So here's my interview with Michael Hardwick. Well, thank you for agreeing to come on the podcast, as I was mentioning to you before. And I'm really looking forward to hearing about the Presidio soldiers, what they've meant for our history here in the West. My personal experience with Presidios was going to visit my grandparents, my grandmother in San Francisco, and my uncle, George, God rest his soul, used to take us. He was a retired naval officer, had served in World War II, and so he used to take us to lunch at the Officers Club at the Presidio in San Francisco.
Been there, done that.
Yeah. I used to play golf there too. And so I didn't know it had anything to do with Spain or our particular history here in California. It wasn't until later that I learned that. So I'm grateful, Mike, that you've written this book and that you're willing to come talk about it and give us some background on Presidios and the soldiers that occupied them and their place in California.
Well, yes, I've been involved with the Presidio project since its inception. Really, it started in 1965, and we were digging in Santa Barbara here in a parking lot, and I got started on that. And then I was in the Navy at the time, and I got shipped to Vietnam, so I spent some time over there on a cruiser, and then I came back to Santa Barbara in 1969. And UCSB and got into anthropology and history, and then again got affiliated with the Presidio. So my research and association with that project here in Santa Barbara, which is El Presidio State Historic Park, which is that's what it is now. But when it started, it was just a backyard parking lot. And we were trying to find the foundations and whatever for it. So unfortunately, I got hooked and my family got hooked. And I spent 50, 60 years of my life researching and reenacting, doing all that sort of thing that went along with it. And couldn't get away from it, still stuck in it. And my whole library is Spanish colonial history, pretty much. I can give you a little bit of a background on who I am and what I've done, and then we could lead into the book.
Yeah, that would be great. And in fact, we had Jerry Jackman on a couple of times, and his overviews of his history at the Santa Barbara Presidio were really enlightening and really helpful. But I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about Santa Barbara and all the other Presidios. So yeah, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, Jerry and I are joined at the hip, if you can say that. He was the executive director of the Presidio when I was there, and we worked hand in hand and are to this day brothers in arms, sort of invalidos from the Presidio project. But this is a little bit from a talk that was given in 2015 by him at the Presidio. And he starts off by saying, let's begin with his service in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War. That's me, where he sat offshore for 6 months or so on the Admiral ship light cruiser USS Oklahoma City, flagship of 7th Fleet. Mike worked in communications ship equipment, and the Admiral received like 7,000 messages a day. He says that duty made a strong impression on him as a young man for many reasons. But for our purposes, is experiencing those huge ship cannon firing at targets on shore in Vietnam was something he never forgot. And that's probably true. I think I got some gun cotton in my veins. Anyway, it piqued his interest in arms and armament, and an interest that carried over into his interest in Spanish period canon. In fact, it is more than an interest. It is a passion. He has produced a several hundred-page manuscript on the arms and armaments of the Santa Barbara Presidio. Now, this was in 2015. What happened was, as we were uncovering the foundations, we had gone to one of our individuals that work with us, Dick Whitehead, had gone to the Bancroft Library and acquired just about everything that was known on the Presidio, most of it in Spanish. And he had copies of it made and brought it to the Presidio, and then had most of it translated. And this later became a book, which he wrote, called Citadel on the Channel. And it pretty much described the history of the Presidio. And out of this also came a map drawn by Pedro Fages at the time of the Presidio. So we had a foundation map of what the Presidio was supposed to be. So Dick used to be a surveyor when he was in the Army, and he was also a public works director at the county of Santa Barbara, retired. So he started chasing foundations. And we began to find that the foundations were still there around several properties. So that became the impetus for sort of chasing the foundations and ultimately restoring the Presidio. Well, the interesting thing about all that was I got interested in the records that he had acquired from the Bancroft Library. And he went through them and wrote a nice history of the Presidio, but he pretty much ignored annual inventories that were taken. It was a garrison, military garrison. And so they were inspected every year. And they would come down and wanted to know the status of the armaments and what was in the magazines and that kind of stuff. And so there were all these reports, annual reports, of what was at the Presidio. So I just decided I was going to start. I'm an anthropologist, so for me, I wanted to get down to what made that operation function. A garrison, what makes it function are arms, and armament, supplies to keep all that going. So I got in there and started putting this stuff together, and I came up with a pretty interesting chronology of what was there at various times. And it was a manuscript for a lot of years, and it just recently, in 2025, became an actual book, Arms and Armaments of the Presidios of California. But just to go on a little bit with my history, one of the things that happened as a result of the Mexican War in 1845, a lot of these Spanish pieces of artillery disappeared from California, and they disappeared because many of them were captured as trophies of war and sent back to the East Coast. And they ultimately wound up at Annapolis, the Naval Academy. So in 2012, Jerry and I went back to Annapolis to photograph these cannons and find out what was there. Prior to that, I had discovered in 1783. Well, one of the things about this Presidio that we had found the map of, there were two gun bastions on opposite ends of the corner of each of the bastion, and so we suspected that these were there for cannon, but nobody really knew what. We suspected they were just, light pieces of artillery or whatever. So I got intrigued with this, and then I found an inventory in these records, these Bancroft records, that indicated that in 1782 there were two bronze 4-pounder cannon at the Presidio that had been ordered in. This was standard equipment for Presidios of a garrison of that type. And so I saw in the inventory where they said they were bronze and they were 4-pounders and they weighed 760 pounds apiece. I thought, those are not small cannon. Well, indeed they were. They were considered light artillery during the time, and they were called, in Spanish terminology, was cañones de campaña, field cannons. And this was what was standard issue for the Presidios of the time. But of course, all these things were missing, so I didn't really know, what that was. But I did have a weight, and I had studied these cannons a little bit, and I noticed, these cannons all have markings on them. And I'm intrigued with these bronze Spanish cannons because, to me, they're pieces of sculpture. They've got engravings on them. They've got the king's crest is on the breech. The dates and all that sort of thing. And then if you look at the trunnions, you can actually, if you interpret the Spanish symbols of weight, you can get the weight off the trunnion of the cannon. So I had all that.
Remind us, what's a trunnion?
Okay, well, a cannon of that time period is a long bronze tube, right? The trunnions are the pivots that stick out from the side. One side of that of that trunnion is marked on it what the gunmetal composition is. They might say something like bronce de Peru y Mexico or something, reused bronze. And then the other side is got markings on it, scratches, which say like something like pesa, P for pesa, which means weight. And and the weights are like in libres. A libre is roughly equivalent to an English pound. And arrobas is like 25 pounds. And then so they would have like P, 7L, and then so many at sign arrobas, and that sort of thing. So you could interpret that and get the weight of the gun. So anyway, I was intrigued. We were intrigued with the fact that what happened to the Spanish artillery, because if you look for cannons in California from the Spanish period, there's only a few of them left. Most of them are up at like San Francisco, and then there's a couple of them down in San Diego, and that's about it. So what happened to the rest of them? Well, a lot of them got captured and transferred east, and the one that finally they wound up at the Naval Academy. So we went there in 2012, and found these things. And lo and behold, and I'll get to this. I wish I could share my screen here. I've got pictures of this stuff. Oh, there we are.
Okay.
There you go. That's good.
Okay.
Well, this gets us into Presidios a little bit.
Mm.
You can page ahead as we go, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we start off with some of these bullets here. Let me give you a little background of Presidios. They started in New Spain. They go back to the 16th century in New Spain, and that's Mexico. And within 2 centuries, there was a line of Presidios, Spanish Presidios, that existed in the American Southwest, all the way from Texas to California. This is as the Spanish were moving up in northern Mexico. They encountered all these native peoples, some of which were pretty hostile. So they evolved this whole frontier method of controlling and managing these people. So that was along the whole Southwest. So when it came time to colonize California in 1769, they used the same basic concept. They bring in the Presidios and the garrisons to support the colonization effort, and then support also the foundation of the missions.
Can I ask you a question?
So, yeah.
Was a Presidio only used in the northern part of New Spain, or were there Presidios in other territories in the Spanish Empire in the Americas, or is this peculiar to our region?
The actual Presidio itself, actually, if you really want to say where it began in North Africa. When the Spanish were fighting the Moors and whatever, they built these garrisons, which were like Presidios, and they were like enclaves of Christianization and a sea of Muslim activity kind of thing. So it's a very ancient kind of concept. And it can, a lot of people like to say, oh, Presidio comes from the Latin presidium, which, means a garrison, and Presidio in later Mexican language implies a prison, but in the 18th century and before, it wasn't that. It was a garrison of troops that were organized in a military fashion. And originally they sort of happened haphazardly, and eventually grew over two centuries into a sort of a military organization of indigenous people who were, had command of horses and were mestizos that lived on the frontier, rugged troops, and they were adapted to that lifestyle, and they were supported then as a form of military in the New World by the Spanish government.
I see.
So from the years, we're looking at the latter evolution of the Presidio concept, and probably the last edition was the little Spanish form of California. When they settled California in 1769, this was coastal settlement, and the Spanish were trying to get control of this area all the way up, because the Russians were coming down from the north, and they wanted to check that advance and claim the territory for Spain. So they used the Presidios as a method of doing that. So from 1769 to 1782, there were 4 Spanish Presidios in Alta, California. California was broken up into Alta, a higher area, and Baja, the lower area. And the first Presidio was in Loreto of Baja, California. So, so from 1769 to 82, we have 4 Presidios in California. One was San Diego was the first, because that's where they started. And it formally became a Presidio in 1773, but it was actually established in 69. Then Monterey was 1770 later. That became the capital, ultimately, of Alta California. San Francisco happened in 76 with Anza, who came through, and one of his members founded that Presidio. And then probably the last Presidio ever founded by the Spanish in the Southwest was the Santa Barbara Presidio in 1782.
Now, what about Sonoma? Because I know they call it a Presidio, but it was more of a small garrison.
Right. It was under Vallejo. That happened later. I don't. It could probably technically be called a Presidio, but it was more during the Mexican period, I think, that we look at that area. So right. Vallejo had a garrison up there, and I think you could probably call it a Presidio, but it wasn't. I don't think it was really founded during the Mexican period, Spanish period. It came during the Mexican period.
Right.
So, what were these garrisons like? They supported mounted soldier companies of leather-jacketed soldiers known as Soldados de Cuerda. And these guys were, as I said, unique. And they ultimately got their own royal regulations, which specified the arms and armament that the soldiers of these garrisons would have. We go to the next slide. You can see the line of Presidios that was established across the Southwest here. And you can see it goes all the way across. The idea being that if one Presidio got in trouble, another one could come and reinforce it. So they ultimately got this line going. And in the 1770s, they moved. This was such a diverse area that needed control that they formed a Comandancia General in a place called Arispe, Sonora, and he was staffed. That was staffed by a commandant general, picked by the Spanish king, and he had almost the same powers as a viceroy. So his purpose in that administrative center, the purpose of that was to, control these presidios and try to maintain, some level of control on that frontier, that northern frontier.
Now I notice that there's Terrenate and Fronteras are very close to one another, and this is just a particular question I have about the Anza expedition.
Uh-huh.
I think some of the members, some of the settlers were from Fronteras and some were from Terrenate. Mm-hmm. Was he gathering people from different presidios?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, he had gotten, they wanted to try to get a land route across to California. And so he was empowered by the Viceroy Bucareli, I believe it was, to try to break through and see if he could get a supply line going from that area through Yuma and ultimately to California, because all the supplies that were going up to California were going by sea, and it was very expensive to keep all that going. So Anza was empowered to do that and to break trail for that.
Gotcha.
Right. We go to the next one. Well, here's our Soldado de Cuera. This is what they look like. They manned the Presidios of the frontier of New Spain, and they were named for their Cuera coats of leather jackets. You can see they're on horseback. They have muskets and lances and shields, which they called a darga, and that sort of thing. We go on to the next one. The two left pictures are a bronze statue in Arizona, in Tucson, in front of the museum there. It's a very, very well done. You can see the equipment that soldier carries. He's got his adarga and his saddle and his pistol and cartridge box. And so they were pretty heavily armed. They had a lance, a shield, two pistols, a shortened musket, short sword, cartridge box, and each soldier had a mule and six horses that had to support him. So this guy just himself to arm one soldier took quite a bit.
Now, were the soldiers, if they have a mule and six horses, are they responsible for taking care of those animals themselves, or were there staff at the Presidio who were in charge of taking care of them?
Presidios, that's the point we're going to get at. Presidios are the garrisons, and so they would have the horse herds that supported the soldiers. So they had livestock that were outside of the Presidios that they maintained, and they kept horses there at the Presidio at the ready in case they needed them, that sort of thing. So this is the substance of the inventories that I got into when you consider the fact that the equipment, livestock, powder, and shot, light artillery, these were all supplied and inventoried under royal regulations for each Presidio. And interestingly enough, those magazine stores included fireworks, which you wouldn't think was a big thing, but they used the fireworks for, festivals and that sort of thing. And you consider the fact that Presidio companies were 35 to 60 men. Now you start multiplying that by pistols, swords, lance blades, powder, shot, all that. They had to keep all that in supply there at the Presidio to keep these soldiers, equipped. That's what I got into later.
Can I ask you a question? I might be getting ahead of myself, but in terms of their armament, you mentioned that they carry a musket, sword, cartridge box, and two pistols. I noticed in some of the material, the book, that you said that the lance was their preferred weapon.
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, most of these soldiers were mestizos and virtually cowboys. I mean, they were proficient with the use of the horse. And the lance, relatively, they got very proficient at using a lance, a mounted lance. So there's a lot to using one of those things. And that's pretty from the standpoint of a formidable foe on the frontier. First of all, if you're on a horse. Second of all, if you've got a lance and you can use it, and you've got a shield, you can pretty much, hold your own against a lot of the Indians. And you can also, you wear that leather jacket, flak jacket, and you can get rid of you can stave off some of the arrows, especially with the adarga that they might shoot at you. So these were, let's say, they were some of the things that these guys were really good at using. And then you add the firearms. There's a little more technical involvement there. They had to get proficient at using them. Had to have the powder and shot, available. Had to maintain these things because they broke keep them up and that sort of thing.
And weren't the Californios, for example, using lances into the 1840s at the Battle of San Pasqual, for example? They were still very good with them.
Oh yeah. I've actually when I was reenacting this, I got my own lance, and I was trying to figure out how to use it and mount it. I always wanted to try it on a horse, but you got to be very careful when you're using one of those things, because you can flip yourself off the horse real easy if you're not delft at the way you handle the lance. They got to where they could twirl them and bring them around in an attack position with the lance over the top of the arm. So if it impaled something and you had to release it, you could let go, and it wouldn't take you off the horse, that sort of thing. So they were very good at using these things. In fact, they called them Lancers of the King.
There you go.
So we go to the next slide there. Okay. Now, I mentioned this earlier about the cannon. And when we went to the Naval Academy, lo and behold, in front of the administrator's, 3-star admiral administrator's house at the academy, were 2 light pieces of artillery, bronze cannons, that exactly matched what I had seen in the inventory at the Presidio Santa Barbara in 1782. And I don't know if you can see this, but there is one of the trunnions, the second photograph, top.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, it says 7Q68A. 7 quintal, 768 pounds. So that was the clue. I knew that by the measurements of the cannon front, that I was a 4-pounder. The weight exactly matched what was on the inventory. The bronze plate on the back says captured from the Mexicans in California, 1845. And then the clincher here, the cascabel in the back, written across there, says who the gun founder was, Josef Barnola, and Barcelona, 1765. So these cannons were made in Barcelona, cast, designed by Barnola, the gun designer, and they came from the Barcelona Royal Foundry in 1765. And in my book, I talk about the Barcelona gun foundry, and they specialized in light artillery for the colonies. So these guns this was the gun, probably not the gun, but the type of gun that was at our Presidio in Santa Barbara. And indeed, most of the Presidios, because this was standard issue for garrisons of that type. So there you see it as a 4-pound cannon, light artillery of the time, and matches the 1782 inventory.
There it is.
There it is. So this was like a first, being able to identify what cannon was there.
And these are on display in the open, it seems, from the photo.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you didn't have to dig back behind some building somewhere.
Yeah, and when you wander around, whether right in front of the admiral's house that runs the academy, there's 2 of them there. They have a name on the gun. But the thing that they don't have is they don't have the King's cipher on the breech. So that was that. Let's go to the next one. So you get an idea of what the Presidios were in the early 1700s. They were there as garrisons, and they were mostly interested in being able to preserve themselves from uprisings and supporting the foundations of the missions and whatever. And so California was divided up into 4 military districts. And each one of these military districts had a presidio and a garrison. And they had soldiers were dispatched from the presidio to establish missions. And indeed, all the missions, each mission had what they called an escolta, detached from the presidio. They would live at the mission and protect the friars and sort of keep the peace, during the time that missions were being founded and even after. So that was the main goal initially. But after 1790, the emphasis became that of sea defense at the Presidios because more ships were plying the coast, and even pirates were off the coast. So it became necessary to provide coastal defense. And this is where we get into construction of what they call castillos, or coastal defense constructions. Now there were basically. Go ahead.
Can we just jump back for 1 second? How long was a typical enlistment or contract for a Presidio soldier? Or how many years did he normally serve?
That's hard to say, but I think many of them actually did that as they actually retired doing that, being soldiers. So it became like a profession for them. I mean, when you think about being on the frontier, if you're in the army and supplied for food and munitions and stuff, and your family is there and you're living, that's a job. That's a way to subsist. So a lot of those soldiers became career soldiers, had families, and then eventually, got ranches and that sort of thing.
Right. Okay.
So anyway, these Royal Engineers after 1790 started putting in garrisons on the coast. Problem is, you can't fend off shipping with light artillery, 4-pound cannon. You need heavier ordnance for that. Well, unfortunately, California was way out in the boondocks, and trying to get heavy pieces of artillery across the isthmus from Spain into California was almost impossible. So what they did is they went down to Peru, and they liberated all these ancient Elizabethan cannon that were down there, and brought them up for coastal defense. And the remnant of that, as you can see at the San Francisco Presidio, all of those cannons date from about 1600 and something. They were all cast in Peru, and they're roughly 8-pounders. The other thing that happened when they brought these cannons up, these are 16 cannons minted and manufactured in the 1600s. The bore sizes were different than the 18th century cannons, which had standardized. So now you had a problem of cannonballs. Where are you going to get them? Because you're not able to cast iron on the West Coast. There weren't the foundries for that, but they did and were able to cast copper. It melts at a lower temperature. So now a lot of these cannonballs that you're going to find are made out of copper to fit these new cannons or these old cannons. So that's what was fired out of those things. So these guns were at the Presidio, and interestingly enough, cannons just like this, and with the same dates minted in Peru, are at the Naval Academy in Washington or Annapolis, and you can see the same guns, the same Peruvian cannon and stuff like that. Even cannon that were captured in Monterey, a couple of them with the names that were on the guns. They're at the Naval Academy.
Huh.
So if you take my book describes each one of these guns at the San Francisco Presidio, and they all have their interesting history of who what is on the breech, who manufactured them. The weights are scribbled kind of in a funny way on the back of the cannon. So there's a history there too. These are beautiful pieces. And the ones that are at the Naval Academy are in not as good a condition because the weather back there is eating away at all the inscriptions. And
what a shame.
Yeah, but these at San Francisco are in much better condition. So were these Castillos ever used? There were two battles, sea battles with foreign shipping. One of them was at Monterey when the pirate Bouchard attacked. He sacked Monterey, held it for 6 days and burned it, and then came down the coast and attacked Refugio here in the Santa Barbara area. And then also the Castillo in San Diego fired on an American ship that had illegally come into the area. So those are the two. But the big thing you were doing with those big guns is, you're bringing them out, you'd lay them out, and foreign shipping would come and they'd see you had these cannons and they'd report it. So it was more show and go than anything else, because it got very, very hard to build these Castillos and they didn't last very long.
I was going to ask you that I only, maybe a few years ago when I started researching the U.S.-Mexican War in California, that I found out about the Castillo San Joaquin, and I didn't realize there was one in San Diego as well.
Oh, yeah.
What happened to these? You said that they didn't last long. How come they're not around anymore?
These things required, maintenance, upkeep, right on the ocean there. The one at San Diego is right there at Point Loma, very, very close to the submarine base. And it was laid out in such a way that it could control the entrance to the harbor there. So, in fact, there is one cannon, actually two cannon, in San Diego left from that Fort Guajaros, it was called, and one of them, it's in the book. It was El Capitan, an iron piece that was on the downtown. Old Town San Diego for a long time. And the other one is El Jupiter, that is a bronze cannon that's in the Serra Museum. And it's been there for ages. The interesting thing about the Jupiter is that it was cast in the Philippines. And all the inscriptions on it allow you to kind of trace it. And the Philippine foundry didn't get started until the 18th century. So it was one of the early guns that came out of that foundry. But if you wander around the San Francisco Presidio, you'll see a number of bronze 24-pounders that were captured during the Spanish-American War and relocated, to the garrison there at Presidio. And many of them are cast in Manila, and they're beautiful things. They weigh in excess of 6,000 pounds.
Wow.
They're all over the place. At the entrance, you come in, there's a couple of cannons on the gate there, and down by Crissy Field, I think there's a couple of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, those guns.
That concludes part one of my interview with Michael Hardwick about Presidios and Soldados on the California frontier. Stay tuned for the next episode when we continue our conversation and talk about, among other things, pirates on the coast of California. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.